Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating paradox: Austria's constitutional neutrality in today's high-stakes geopolitical landscape. We're looking at a country that sits right at the heart of Europe, deeply integrated into the European Union, yet stubbornly clinging to a military non-alignment policy dating all the way back to the early days of the Cold War. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to us right now? Well, because in an era of hybrid warfare and rapidly shifting global power dynamics, Austria's stance challenges our basic assumptions about what security and alliances actually mean in the 21st century.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're going to cover, first, the neutrality paradox. Second, forging a Cold War buffer. Third, Vienna as the spy capital. Fourth, the public knowledge gap. And finally, the future of non-alignment. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The neutrality paradox.
So following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, we saw a massive, absolute seismic shift in European security. That event completely shattered the illusion for a lot of European nations that neutrality alone could act as a shield against modern warfare. But here's the thing. While historically neutral neighbors rushed to join the NATO alliance, Austria stood firm. Which poses the massive question, why? Finland and Sweden, both with incredibly long traditions of military non-alignment, looked at the invasion of Ukraine and rapidly concluded that their security could only be guaranteed by NATO's Article 5 collective defense. Austria, sharing a continent with the exact same threat landscape, made the exact opposite choice.
It's a really stark contrast when you compare the Nordic reaction to modern threats with Austria's steadfast commitment to the status quo. Get this, an overwhelming 74% of the Austrian public strongly prefers to maintain their permanent neutrality. 74%! That is a massive divergence in strategic thinking compared to the rest of Europe. To understand why 3/4 of the country absolutely refuses to budge, we've got to look at how this identity was forged in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 2, forging a Cold War buffer.
To really wrap our heads around this massive public support, we have to travel back in time to the end of the post-World War II occupation. For Austria, neutrality isn't just some policy on a piece of paper, it's literally the foundation of its modern independence. In 1955, a rapid succession of events formed the ultimate geopolitical compromise, a deal that actually got 80,000 Soviet troops to pack up and leave. After a decade of being carved up into 4 occupation zones by the Allied powers, Austrian leaders struck a bargain. In April of that year, the Moscow Memorandum laid the groundwork. The Soviets basically said, "We'll leave, but only if you promise not to join Western military alliances." Then, by May, the Austrian State Treaty formally re-established the independent republic. And finally, on October 26th, literally right after the last foreign soldier left, the Austrian parliament passed the constitutional law on neutrality.
So the crucial takeaway here is that this shield of permanent neutrality legally barred Austria from joining pacts like NATO, effectively creating a demilitarized buffer zone right in the middle of Central Europe. It started as a highly pragmatic survival tactic, but over time, it evolved into a deeply cherished national identity. For decades, it allowed Vienna to play the role of global bridge builder, hosting UN headquarters and facilitating East-West dialogue. But fast forward to today, and that very same shield designed to protect the country is actually being exploited.
Let's explore that in Section 3. Vienna, the spy capital. You see, the romanticized idea of being this neutral mediator is clashing head-on with the harsh reality of asymmetric threats. It's honestly fascinating to see how bluntly Austria's own intelligence officials assess the situation today. When the State Intelligence Service explicitly states that neutrality is essentially a magnet for aggression rather than a protection against it, well, we really need to pay attention. Russia, in particular, has long treated Austria's neutral status not as some boundary to be respected, but as a strategic loophole to be utilized.
And we have the specific operations to prove it. Foreign intelligence has essentially treated Vienna as a soft target, using its neutrality to bypass Western security. We're talking about incidents like the 2023 Martin Weiss affair, where Austrian intelligence uncovered a major pro-Russian influence operation involving a former diplomat. We're looking at serious cyber intrusions like the ones by the Russian state-sponsored hacking group APT-28, also known as Fancy Bear, targeting the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And there's this ongoing, systemic infiltration of cultural networks used to recruit assets and push Kremlin narratives right in the heart of Europe. Because Austria isn't fully integrated into NATO's collective intelligence and cyber defense frameworks, adversaries increasingly view it as a backdoor straight into the European Union.
This leads us right into Section 4, the public knowledge gap.
So here's where we hit a really fascinating disconnect between actual geopolitical vulnerability and what the public believes. How exactly does a society reconcile this intense intelligence threat with an overwhelming desire to stay neutral? Well, national polling data reveals an incredible irony. While the vast majority absolutely love neutrality, over a third of the population cannot actually define what it means. Only about 37% correctly identify it as military non-participation. A massive 33% fall into a category of simple ignorance, meaning they love the buzzword but are totally clueless about the policy itself. Another 17% incorrectly believe it means diplomatic all-partiality, essentially thinking Austria is legally bound to treat all sides of a conflict equally. But that's not the case at all. Austria is politically aligned with the EU and actively supports sanctions against Russia.
What this builds is a really complex, deeply divided public mind. We see a huge chunk of the population relying heavily on emotional attachment rather than a clear-eyed strategic view. You have the security pragmatists making up nearly half the population at almost 47%. They understand the benefits of neutrality, but actually recognize the risks. But then you have the uninvolved spectators at 30% and the military-neutral optimists at 23%. If you add those up, that is over half the country passively supporting or blindly idealizing neutrality without acknowledging the glaring disadvantages, like the lack of a collective defense umbrella. It's almost like a cultural security blanket, and it actively prevents a purely rational debate about modern defense.
Moving to our final part, Section 5, the future of non-alignment. So, how do Austrian politicians balance this immense public affection with the undeniable intelligence threats practically knocking at their door? They have to thread an incredibly narrow needle between constitutional law, public sentiment, and real-world danger. The government's answer to this is a doctrine of strategic neutrality, basically maintaining the legal status quo while actively preparing for modern threats. As Defense Minister Claudia Tanner points out, Austria can no longer afford to be naive, and Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer echoes this, asserting that while Austria's history as a bridge builder remains vital, it absolutely requires adaptation. Security, as they say, begins with awareness and preparedness. And to actually back up that preparedness, Austria is opening its wallet. They are nearly doubling their defense spending from 0.77% of GDP back in 2022 to a targeted 1.5% by 2027. For decades, Austria was often criticized as a free rider, relying on the security provided by its 9 NATO member neighbors. But now, this massive geopolitical shock has triggered a huge budgetary course correction. Even without officially joining NATO, they are rapidly rearming and boosting interoperability with their neighbors to counter both hybrid and conventional threats. The traditional boundaries of neutrality are being stretched to their absolute limits here. Austria is deeply embedded in the EU's common security and defense policy. They've signed on to the European Sky Shield Initiative, which is a German-led, largely NATO-oriented air defense system, and through NATO's Partnership for Peace program, which Austria actually joined way back in 1995, Austrian troops have participated in over 100 joint exercises and deployed thousands of personnel to NATO-led peacekeeping missions in places like the Balkans. Honestly, they are doing almost everything short of actually signing Article 5. As we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a profound geopolitical puzzle about the true cost of fence-sitting in the 21st century. Austria is trying to have it both ways, right? Preserving that beloved cultural symbol of 1955 neutrality while quietly integrating into the Western defense architecture of 2025 just to survive. But as those intelligence breaches in Vienna clearly show, gray zones are incredibly dangerous places to stand. So the big question you should take away from all of this is, in an era of borderless cyber attacks and proxy warfare, is true neutrality even possible anymore? Or is it just a comforting illusion waiting to be shattered? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives behind the world's most complex policies.